Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see so many of you people here in the is it officially called the community track?
Yes.
The community track. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak here, to be given the privilege to rant a little bit to you guys about code, and I'm very happy to see that so many of you guys showed up. This picture behind me, this is a very nice, pretty bank in Stockholm, Sweden. And today I'm going to talk about this bank a little bit, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Because this bank might actually play an important role in the Ruby on Rails framework. But first off, let me introduce myself. My name is Arjan. You can find me online usually with this username AVDGAAG, or find me on my personal homepage. Yes, I've got one. And I'm fortunate enough to work at a company called Brighton from Utrecht here. It's an awesome company, builds pretty web applications. And of course, I have to mention it, Brighton is actually hiring. So if you are interested in writing awesome stuff, do come and find me, come and see me after this talk, and we'll grab a coffee together. Now let's see how well this Wi-Fi connection holds. Not terribly well, apparently. So we'll do it like this. Today we're going to talk about web development that hurts even less. So the slogan for Ruby on Rails, the Ruby on Rails framework, has always been it's web development that doesn't hurt, it doesn't suck. Well, we can do better. Is the sound all right for everybody in the back of the room? So I have been doing web development for a bunch of years. I think I started in the early 2000s, and back then I was doing mainly PHP. And the success for me as a PHP developer back then, when I had no clue what I was doing, was, look at this, I got something to work. I actually made a page and I can, press a button and something happens. And a mail is sent out and this and that and the other thing happens. I was very proud of myself. This is around 2004 when this guy showed up. This is David Heinemeier Hansen. He's the creator of the Ruby on Rails framework. And it's around 2004 that he released, I think it was 2004, that he publicly released the first version of the Ruby on Rails framework. And to understand where that framework is coming from, we have to go look at the context, at the times. The times were different then. I'll have you know I'm actually an historian, so I like going back in time and telling stories a little bit. And apart from people like me who had no clue and trying to make stuff work with PHP, that's like one half of the software community. There was maybe another half of the software community where lots of people were doing enterprise Java and struggling with abstract singleton factory proxy bean servlets and dependency injection container algorithms with XML configuration. I imagine they had kind of the same problem like I did and were proud when they got actually something to show up on the page. Like, look at me, I've actually got something to work. And David came and he built something new and he said, we can do something better than this. And he released the Rails framework. And basically, David was an asshole. He said, all you guys, you suck. You're doing it wrong. You're stupid. You're idiots. Java sucks. PHP is for kids. Look at this awesome new cool thing I've got. And he was an asshole, but, well, he got the message across. And he did that rather well with a famous screencast video that he published, where he built this weblog in 20 minutes using the Ruby on Rails framework. And he published that, and while he was writing that, one of the phrases in his video was, look at all the code I'm not writing. Look at all the stuff Rails does for us. And I remember seeing that video, and I was behind my computer and I was typing away, watching the video, and actually the curtains opened, this beam of light came through the window, shone on my computer screen. I could hear angels sing, and I thought, well, this is the stuff I want to do. Look at this guy. He was building this app in 20 minutes. Look at all the stuff he's doing, and especially look at all the stuff he's not doing. I was totally into it. And so was David himself, and he was not afraid to tell people. But, of course, he got some pushback. And people said, well, it's easy to say Java sucks. There's plenty of bad Java code out there. And people said, yeah, it's easy to say PHP sucks. There's lots of bad PHP code out there. That doesn't make PHP inherently a bad language. It doesn't mean that Java is always inherently a bloated language. But then David, and I'm using DHH as a proxy for like the Ruby and the Rails community, they kind of shrugged that off and said, well, sure, a sufficiently competent programmer, sure, he can make good software in PHP. He can make good software in Java. But these languages and these frameworks don't make you want to do the right thing. Now look at Ruby and look at Rails. Ruby and Rails make you want to do the right thing. They make you want to write beautiful code. That's what he said. And that's the argument they used for a long time. Now, admittedly, I think David kind of handled the criticism well. There's people that say, well, Rails is just way too simple, it's a toy, or Rails is way too complex. And he has actually taken on his detractors and said, well, show me the code. We can't spout this intellectual nonsense forever. In the end, we can talk about paradigms and theories all we want, but in the end, it's about the code. And he actually took on the challenge online, you know, show me what you want to write. I'll show you how I would write it in Rails. And let's compare the two. Usually, of course, he thought he came out the better. But, well, there's some, I think, some personal preference in there. But he was really committed to showing why Rails was better. But there's a risk there. Because Ruby and Rails really made a really strong community about people being really proud to be writing Rails, to be writing Ruby code. People really identifying with the community that was built around the framework and around the Ruby language. And this kind of evolved into an echo chamber, where if you keep repeating the same message long enough to the same group of people and say, you know, PHP really sucks. Yeah, PHP really sucks. We write Ruby. Yeah, PHP really sucks. If you repeat it long enough and everybody repeats it, then you start to believe it. But is it actually true? Is Java always bloated? Some people are nodding yes, but well, you not necessarily know. So you kind of get stuck in this Rails community where you think, well, maybe there's more to this story. Now here's an example of some news that was published the other day. It's from the Rails weblog. It says Rails is going to ship Rails 5 with an invented file system monitor. Yeah. For if those not in the know, Rails is big. It takes a long time to launch. We don't want to launch all the time when we make changes to our code. So we do live reloading of code. So every time you make a change in your editor, your server is still running and it reloads all the stuff. And you see your changes immediately in your development server. That stuff is slow. And you don't want to keep stopping and restarting your server. Well, they figured out something for that. They built this tool called Spring that actually preloads your framework into memory so you can actually boot it quicker. And when you really need to, now they're building an evented file system monitor right into the heart of the framework so we can listen for changes on the file system and reload code when stuff happens. Now you could say, well, I'm not against speed. Speed is always good. But to some extent, it's like, what the hell are we doing here? This is a Ruby web framework, and this is a lot of stuff. This is complex stuff that is being built here. Is this really the right decision? Back to the bank. This is a bank in Stockholm wherein, I think it was 73, a bunch of people were held hostage at gunpoint here for 6 days. And the interesting thing about this situation was when the ordeal was over, these people were rescued, they actually started rejecting help from government agencies, from the people they were trying to help them. They actually started to sympathize kind of with the people that only moments ago were holding them at gunpoint. And this phenomenon became known as Stockholm Syndrome. Now, Stockholm Syndrome might be something we run into if we're in a community that is as tightly knit and has this strong identity, is as cohesive as the Ruby and the Rails communities. We get used to it, we identify with it, and we say, well, that's who we are. Hello, my name is Arjan, I'm a Ruby and Rails developer, and Java sucks. That's who I am. That's what I have to believe to be part of this community. But is that actually true? Well, I can tell you, there's a different world. There is another pill we can take and have a look outside. And I'm not going to tell you today all the reasons why you should stop using Rails. I am going to tell you today a bunch of reasons why it is worthwhile to look at other stuff that's happening in the Ruby community. That is to say, there are a lot of people who have been in the Ruby community for years, have built lots of apps, and are now building new things. And these new things, they are no longer aiming to imitate Rails. They're not building a new framework just like Rails, but just slightly different. No, they're actually trying in some areas to be better than Rails. They have learned from Rails. They said, okay, we loved it in the beginning, but I think we can do it one step better. I'm going to show you some examples of the stuff that I found in other frameworks and in other libraries that I think have a nice different approach to some of the stuff that irks me in Rails currently. Now, I'm not to judge what pill you are going to take, or if you want to stay inside the Rails community and say this is great, or maybe look at some other stuff. Just to say there's alternatives. So let's dive in. And warning, there's code up ahead. But if you're not experienced with Rails, don't worry, I'll talk you through it. Here's a piece of Ruby code, typical for any Rails application. I had to play with the formatting, of course, because it needs to fit on the slide and you need to read it, but I think it's big enough like this. And this is not really atypical Rails code. I'm pretty sure that if I would show this to David Heinemeier Hansen, he would say, nah, I wouldn't write it like that. But I sure have written code like this, and I sure see a lot of code like this in the projects I come across on a daily basis. And there's a few things going on here that I don't particularly like, and I want to walk you through them. By the way, for those not in the know about Rails, this is a controller. It handles the web requests, and it has a bunch of actions. So we can see we have a class here that represents our controller, and it has a method for our action, that's our endpoint. I'm only showing one here, but usually a controller would hold 7 methods. So it knows how to do 7 different things. That means it has 7 responsibilities for a single object. I'm not particularly fond of that. Also, note the inheritance. A controller inherits from a application controller, which inherits from a abstract base thing in order to share some code, because that's basically what we're doing. We just want to pull in some code. Also, where's the params coming from? It's just there. There's a method and it gets you HTTP params. God knows where it came from. There's some SQL right here in your controller layer. It's not actual literal SQL, but still we're writing SQL queries. Same for this part where we have an attribute. Also, it has some nice domain logic in here in the controller, because this is where we define what it means for an article to be published or not. And finally, this is my favorite. We're assigning an instance variable. Now, at one time, I was at the Rails Girls workshop and somebody asked me, like, what does it mean if there is like this @ symbol in front of a name? And I told them, well, this is an instance variable. And what's that? Well, that's a piece of data that's exclusively available to this single object, and nobody else can touch it. And she was like, well, you just told me that if I want stuff to appear on the page and all these template files, I need to put an @ sign in front of it. So, yeah, okay. So normally in Ruby, this is like purely private data, but with Rails, this is basically your public interface, and they're just going to copy everything to the rest of the world. That sort of stuff is really hard to explain to beginners. It sure looks nice, but... So, there's multiple actions, there's code sharing, there is object internals leaking out into the world, we're writing domain logic, we're writing SQL. There's a lot of stuff happening here. Now here's an alternative. This is a piece of code that was taken from the Lotus framework. And Lotus is a new framework, it's in its early stages, but it's really interesting. I like it. And this is a controller action in the Lotus framework. And it basically does the same thing. But let me talk you through it. First off, what we said was our controller a minute ago was a class holding several actions as methods. I think Lotus is taking a little more honest approach and say, well, there's just a module, it's just a namespace basically, and we've got a bunch of objects in there. A single endpoint is a single class. There is not multiple endpoints in a single class. There's no inheritance. There's some code sharing. It has include web action, and there's a bunch of Lotus stuff in there. What it exactly does is not really relevant, but the point is it uses a mix-in. Now I can hear you think, well, a mix-in is basically inheritance as well, true, but it's a little bit more honest about, you know, I'm just grabbing some code here. I'm not saying anything about hierarchies or relationships or is a or kind of. I just want to pull in a bunch of functions. Also, there's this explicit exposure of the article. So I can assign an article and I have to explicitly say, this value I want to have published to the rest of the world. And the Lotus frameworks works in such a way that you can take an instance of this object, of this create object, and ask it, you know, what's your exposed data? And the rest of the framework can use that. Finally, the params object is just injected as an argument. I still don't know where it's coming from, but at least I can see, look, this is its entry point. It's just an argument, and I can trust, you know, regular OO programming. I can trust, you know, somebody is making that for me. It doesn't just appear. And finally, there's the article repository, and it has a scope called published. Inside that scope is defined the same kind of logic that we saw a minute ago. Now, you could do that in Rails. Rails has scopes, sure, but you don't have to. One thing Lotus does, it gives you a repository object, and you cannot use your adapter, for example Postgres, specific methods outside of that object. It's all internal. If you want to have a controller perform some kind of a query, you will have to write your own method, even if it's for a single where. So, the example we had here, where we can write a where or a not or an order or any kind of clause to build a query, we can't actually do that in the Lotus repository. You have to wrap it in a method and name the damn thing. So, let's see. Skip ahead to the right slide. So that would be the first lesson, I think, that the Lotus framework took from working with Rails is it's much better to just have a bunch of plain objects. Just simple plain objects. Minimal interfaces are much easier to deal with than this typical Rails objects that get instantiated somehow with all these magic properties that do kinds of stuff for you. Here's another one. There's a bunch of stuff going wrong here. This is a piece of Rails view code. Quite typical of normal Rails app. Except that it is leaking the information from the database. Because right here I'm saying I want the text field for the title attribute of my model. How does my model know that it has a title attribute? That it knows that by inspecting the database. if you ever wrote a database query renaming one of your columns and suddenly have all your views break, then you know what I'm getting at here. That is annoying. Also, we're building a form for an object. That object will build some kind of URL for us through a rather advanced polymorphic routing system, where it goes through the router and figures out by the type of the object, in this case it will be a class article, what kind of way it needs to build a URL. Also, is this stuff even valid ERB? Spoiler, no. Rails has actually quite a bunch of monkey patches in there to make ERB code look prettier. Because this stuff, having a line with a block and then HTML again and then new ERB, that's not valid ERB stuff. So, meh. It's pretty, but no, I'm not a big fan of that. This is again from the Lotus framework. I'm gonna look at some others as well. It's basically the same thing, but now we have a form builder that just outputs a bunch of HTML in a string. It has a single ERB tag, no monkey patches. I have to call explicitly what kind of route I want to use in this form as the action. There's just this object that I can use to call my routes on. There's no introspection about what kind of object I'm putting in here. It's just, well, just use this URL. And you might wonder, isn't it still leaking information from the database? Because we're still calling a text field method here, referencing a database column. Well, Lotus actually comes with a data mapper rather than an active record, ORM, which means that we explicitly map columns from the database to attributes in our application. If we want to rename a column, we could, in theory, or in practice too, we could just keep the same name in our application but map it in a different column in the database. If I want to change a column in the database, I only have to make a change at one point, the mapper that maps columns to entities, and be done with it. Stuff won't break if we do that. And one more thing I find really interesting about Lotus is that it treats views as objects, and there's a bunch of helper methods. Now everybody loves helper methods in Rails, especially because there's just this bunch of them that are available more or less globally in your view context. Hundreds of methods that can help you build pretty HTML pages. Well, Lotus has a bunch of them. But by definition, they're all in modules. You include them in your view classes. And they're all private. Much the same as with a repository, all this stuff you can't actually use directly in a template. You would have to use them in your view class, wrap them in methods, give them a meaningful name. Again, it's not as if you couldn't do this kind of stuff in Rails. You're just not really nudged into that direction. So again, Lotus really focuses on pretty interfaces, explicit and intention-revealing interfaces, with the emphasis on explicit. All this implicit deduction from the database or just globally available methods that just happen to appear there in your template. No, make it explicit. Make explicit what you are going to use. And also, please don't use monkey patching. It's not necessary. ERB is fine. And it only makes matters complex. Next up, I really like this one. This is Active Record. Active Record is pretty nice. It has validations, pretty cool. Validations can have conditions. So you can actually control when a validation happens based on some kind of result of some kind of method. Also, you can have multiple validations. Also, you can specify particular contexts when they run, for example, only on creation or only on update. Oh, and by the way, there's also hooks that you can run before validation. So you can influence the way validations are performed, if they are effective, and of course, yeah, you can always control when those hooks run. This gets confusing really, really fast. And the documentation proudly proclaims there is over 19 callbacks that you can have immense power controlling the state of your model. I don't want to control the complex state of my model with 19 different sorts of callbacks. It's very, very hard to figure out if you have any old record, any old model object in your Rails app. what the hell is going on here? Is this persistent? Is this valid? Did it just come from the database and does it need to be validated again? Have I validated it? What's going on? There's alternatives. This is a Lotus entity, which is a plain Ruby object. And like I told you, Lotus uses a data mapper pattern. So we only define a way to build these kinds of objects. So I'm not showing you on this slide, but there's a piece of code that says these columns on the database have to go to this object and these attributes. That's it. The entity doesn't do much more. Lotus actually moves validation and transaction scripts and all kinds of hooks in all kinds of other objects. And there's even more. This is not Ruby, but make no mistake, this is Elixir code, and Elixir is very much a Ruby offspring. It's created by José Valim, who has been a long time Rails contributor. He built a new language, and I'm not here to talk about the language, but he also built, well, co-built a database library called Ecto. And Ecto also explicitly moves validation and filtering of parameters into a specific kind of, well, it's not an object, but a specific kind of value and related set of functions called a change set. With Elixir being a functional programming language with immutable values, you don't have state in models, so you kind of have to figure out something else. But it works really, really well to say, I have this value that represents a change in my data. This value, this is an object that describes, I'm going to change value x to y, and I can validate that. And I can even combine different change sets and put a name on something that is mostly implicit in dealing with active record models. So don't be afraid of having more objects. Move responsibility out into other objects. There's no harm in that. There's more in web applications than just models, views, and controllers. They're called layers for a reason. We don't only have those three classes, we can build more, and we should, to make things manageable. We can even go one step further. I really like this stuff. This is an example from ROM, R-O-M, which stands for the Ruby Object Mapper. And this is a project that basically, well, maps objects in Ruby. And it takes this data mapper step to, well, to the next level. It says, we're going to do away with the idea of a model, of an object. We're basically only transforming data, taking a hint from the functional programming community, saying, well, we're just going to take any data source and you can load that into a bunch of values, into a bunch of structs. For the most part, well, you just get a bunch of values, that works. That's basically what Lotus does. But ROM takes us another step, and this is what I really wanted to show. It has a rich library of transformations that you can apply. So you can, given a set of input data, you can prefix, unprefix, suffix, wrap, fold, group. You can really transform that data into what your application needs. And that is really cool. And the promise for ROM is then, you don't need a bunch of different objects that know how to work with your single model. No, we have different transformation pipelines to get just the data we need. So this is a whole different step from, a whole departure from the active record pattern. So what's the takeaway from this? There's interesting stuff happening, and it's about state. It's about managing state, which is hard. An active record model is a big thing, has a buttload of responsibilities, and it's hard to keep track of what's happening there, and it's way, way easier to transform simple data. Also, we'll do another. That is, Rails is database agnostic. You can switch from Postgres to MySQL every day. Nobody cares. But then again, all the data, all the information about your data schema, what columns there are, what types they are, they leak into your entire application like an octopus. You can actually turn that around like Lotus and ROM do and say, well, you embrace your database, actually put work in there, design a good system, make it do what it's good at, but then isolate it in your app. Up to the point of a mapper, that's where the database logic goes, and from then on it's your application. So turn this around. Don't ignore your database, use it, but isolate it. Of course, talk about what's possibly wrong with Rails has to include something about the asset pipeline. Don't want to spend too much time on this. It's a big thing, it's complex. If you want to do something with JavaScript, and let's say I want to use ES6, for example, then there's always the question, right, I know how to do that, I have a library for that. How can I do that with Rails, with sprockets and the asset pipeline? How can I make that work? And sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't. And I'm not even going to say anything about putting JavaScript code in gems as package management solution. That's, well, didn't really work out. Here's a difference. Here's a different take. This is a piece of configuration code for the Phoenix framework. Phoenix, again, is Elixir code. And this is a framework, and they have sort of an asset pipeline. It's the last option that we give here for our application. It's called watchers. And there you can enter a command that does stuff. And its primary use case is have something watch your files and compile your assets, compile your JavaScript or your CSS. That's it. And Phoenix comes pre-configured with the branch build tool, and it has this configuration. Whenever we start the server, the Phoenix server, run this process. A node process, the branch tool, have it watch and compile your assets. And from there on out, you're on your own. And actually that's fine. Branch is good at compiling stuff, at building my assets. Webpack is very good at it. I want to use Webpack. With Rails, it's actually a bit tricky, because Sprockets is kind of integrated. Not really fully integrated, but still, you know, Rails assumes Sprockets. With Phoenix, they just say, well, just enter your command here and be done with it. And use a tool that's good at compiling your assets if you want to do that. Or don't use anything if you don't want to. And that ties into the do one thing well philosophy. Rails is pretty good at serving web pages, database-backed applications. But does it really have to be a build tool? No, not really. Also, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. We've been using this a long time. Back when the asset pipeline came out, it was pretty good, it was awesome. But by now, I think stuff like Webpack or Grunt or Gulp or whatever of the myriad build tools we have in the JavaScript world are way better at dealing with this sort of problem. And we should be able to use that easily. I think this is my last example. I want to show you this one. Also an example from Active Record with associations, where an Active Record association is actually a kind of object with mixed state records in there. If I ask an article for its comments, I might get 3 persisted comments, but I can also build a new one. So I've got a list of 3 persisted and 1 unpersisted comment in this array-like object. That's confusing. Ecto, for example, explicitly notes this, like we are not going to do that. There's one way and one way only to work with the data. So transparency is key, is important. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I want to get to this example. Again, with the associations, pretty nice. I've got a bit of view code, it shows an article and I decide I want to include its comments. I want to show comments with this article. And if I don't take special attention and special care of what happens in the controller layer here, I'm running into an n+1 query problem. Very, very easy to do, especially if you have lots of views that get reused all over the place. It's hard to avoid these kinds of problems. Unless, for example, with Ecto, you can't actually implicitly load associations. I can query, if I define an article model in Ecto, I can query for it, and if I don't ask for its comments, it says, well, sorry, I didn't get that. I know what you want, but I didn't load it. If you want to get them, you will have to write the single query explicitly telling Ecto, I want you to load that stuff. Now, this seems like cumbersome, And it is, of course, kind of. But again, Ecto here explicitly notes from experience with working with Rails, we're not going to do that. You're going to have to be explicit because it's confusing and we want to push developers into doing the right thing. And that's my last lesson that can be taken here, is to think, as a framework, as a language, you need to make sure you nudge the developers into the right direction. Well, how does that relate to Stockholm Syndrome? I'm not sure. It's not as if David Heinemeier Hansen is really like a bank robber pointing a gun at us. And if I would show these examples to him, he would surely say, well, come on, there's better ways to write that. The thing is, I think he would say, you know, there's plenty of bad Rails code out there, but that doesn't mean that Rails is inherently bad. Exactly. But does it move you into the right direction? Well, let's be honest, I want to quickly point out some stuff that I really like about Rails. So it's multi-format endpoints. Like I want to have HTML, XML from my endpoint. It really works well with HTTP. I love that stuff. HTTP caching, routing, it really handles that well with a pretty nice interface. Even though if there's a little bit of magic in here, it really works. And I especially love form builders. Now, form builders are a special extension that you can write yourself. You can provide a type of object to Rails that you can use to build forms and have it spit out all kinds of boilerplate HTML code. And this stuff, if you build a lot of forms, then you can really make headway by using form builders and avoiding a lot of boilerplate in writing code. Normally you would use a library for this, such as Simple Form or Formtastic. They're really good at this stuff, and that really takes, well, it's a boring part, writing forms, and you can really speed that up using Rails. And finally, this stuff, to be honest, Rails solves problems I never knew existed. It's got a lot of attention for security, admittedly, because mostly, you know, it's their own problem, like they automatically parse XML or whatever. But still, there's lots of people working here. It has elegant solutions for security problems that I never even knew about. So that's the stuff it's good at. I mostly like it to just quickly build stuff. Man, I feel really productive using Rails. Really productive. And every new project I start, I'm happy that I can use Rails. Every new project I say, damn, this is good that I can use Rails now. Every old project I open up, not so much. Every old project I think, man, if only that they hadn't used Rails, because this has become a mess. So the takeaway then would be that good design is design that nudges us into the right direction. That's the essence of good design, and Rails has pretty good design, but it's not there yet. It has some kind of right to make fun of the Java community and the PHP guys for making sloppy code, but we suffer from the exact same problem. There's lots of stuff that could be improved in the Rails community. Luckily, as I hopefully have shown you, there's quite a lot of ideas in the Ruby community, with people actually trying out new ideas. And secondly, second takeaway would be that Rails has become very successful with this mantra of convention over configuration. And it really works, and I'm not advocating that we should abandon that, but I think a whole new wave of frameworks and libraries are showing a new mantra, a new guiding principle that says favor simplicity over convenience. Because convenient, that's what Rails is. It's very complex, but very convenient. But if you really want to optimize for developer happiness, you'll have to optimize for simplicity. And of course, as we have heard this morning from Peter, building simple things is hard. But we're getting there. The community is getting there. It's building there. It's going towards that goal. So it's very worth your while to check it out. So, I've been Arjan van der Gaag. You can find me online. If you want anything, if you want to know about the frameworks or the libraries I've mentioned here that you haven't heard of yet, come find me after this talk. I can tell you some stuff about it. I can point you in the right direction. Also, shout out to Brighton. It's a nice place to work at, and to Utrecht RB, the Utrecht Ruby community, which is where a lot of the interesting stuff happens around here. Thank you very much. When's the next meetup? Good question.
25th of November. We are building 2D games with Ruby.
Cool.
25th of November, that's it.
Okay.
So, thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you very much for the talk. It's really interesting.
Welcome.
You mentioned the Rails mantra, or the quote that the EHH used was, look at all the code, I'm not right.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's a trap? Or is there a sweet spot that Rails just went too far in it? Or should you ended up with simplicity over convenience?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Rails has as write as little code as possible. And with a bunch of these other frameworks, especially Ecto, for example, and Lotus, they explicitly state, like, look, you're going to write boilerplate. You're going to write, writing a class for every single action in like a controller in Lotus is a lot of work. So what? It'll take you a minute, but on the long run, it will be so much nicer to work with. What you should do to manage this boilerplate is just use a decent editor, use snippets, use templates, use generators. That's where you can make the profit, not by magic meta-programming and implicit introspection about how you can avoid writing code. So, yeah, I would say less boilerplate, yes, definitely. Or more boilerplate and deal with it differently. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes?
When you look back at your old Rails projects, what made you regret using Rails at that time? Was it that you couldn't upgrade to a newer version of Rails or migrate to Pointy? What was it that made you invest so much more time?
Right, so the question is, if I look back at my old Rails projects, what made me look for alternatives?
Yeah.
Right. The thing is, if I opened up old Rails projects that I wrote, I just can't find stuff. There's 3 places to look. There's models, views, and controllers. That's what Rails gives you. And if what I'm looking for isn't there, then I'm having a real hard time looking for where is this particular method defined. I can't grep for it because it's all magically concatenated, dynamically defined. I can't find it. I came up with my own stuff. I'll call them services or jobs or interactors or kinds of stuff. And I'm looking for that. And especially the things that are happening underwater that Rails does for you, that you don't really understand. That's what makes it hard to get back to it later. And I think that's where I also realized the difference with Rails doing lots of stuff for you and Rails for being beginners. The fact that it does a lot for you makes it easier for beginners, but it's not actually aimed at beginners. All the mistakes I made, maybe not following the Rails conventions, or maybe not following the Rails party line, or upgrading, but only partially upgrading, leaving some old stuff in there, that's when things really got confusing really quickly, and that's when I just started to break things. And that's what got me to look for alternatives.
Okay.
Maybe something a little bit more rigid, a bit more explicit. That would be easier to deal with, easier to understand for me as a developer.
Yeah, I could share some personal experience there. I once had this application where I had basically all my MVCs, I had them namespaced in an admin namespace for the CMS. And once there came this feature request for public end users to create events, right? But they were namespaced in CMS. And all the routes that the form generates, they will go to the CMS. So when a user clicks submit on the event, they will be taken to the CMS, which I don't want, of course.
Yeah, and that seems...
So, and that is something that you will run into.
Yeah, and that might seem from the framework perspective, it's like, what is he trying to do here? Probably this. And usually he's right, until he's not. And then you struggle to have it, well, we saw that in the previous talk as well, then you struggle to make this big yeti go the other direction. And they say, look, I want you to do the other thing, and that's where it gets hard. example could serve. Thanks.
Well, I guess we're running out of time, so
Okay.
thank you very much again.
Okay. Thank you.